Hello again. Hello again. How's everybody doing? Welcome to the Thursday afternoon lecture, Thursday morning lecture. It's good to see all of my crowd there. Looks like we got Etta, Riley C, Tara Solomon. Uh, Goodness me, Lydia's out there. Leanne. It's a great crowd today. How's everybody doing? You ready for the weekend? The gang is all here. You're right. Tara, that's definitely the way to put it. The gang is all here. Hey, guess what? I've got my whiteboard camera hooked up, so you'll see right here. Hold on, let me see. Right there, I can go to my whiteboard and I can just reach right over here in anything I need to write on today. So now I've got my full video set put together in my office. So this is where I'll be streaming from now on. So. Right, it is definitely time to have some free time. That's what I always love about the end of the semester. For a week or two, you can just erase everything that's going on, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to be organized, Leanne. Doing my best, doing my best. So let's go ahead and talk about the second part of Chapter 13 today. Looks like we've got about 8 or 9 people in the audience. Hi, Heba. Good to see you. Fantastic. You're a class, but I am burned out. Winter class, but I am burned out. Ed, are you talking about one of those winter classes that you take in 3 weeks over Christmas? I don't know if you folks have ever seen these classes, but you can go to some schools and take college classes in like 2 or 3 weeks. We used to use them when I helped coach the baseball team. If we had a player that failed a class and was short their credits to play baseball next year, we would send them to one of these 3-week winter classes. No, they don't have them here I don't think, and I don't think they're great, but they are a way to stack up credits if you need them, and if you're in a hurry, like most of you students probably are, it's not a bad strategy. Cool. Okay. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and talk about personality development. Today we're going to talk about the trait approach in measuring personality. So on Tuesday we talked all about how personality develops, theories about how personality traits develop. Today we're not going to worry about where personality comes from as much as we're going to worry about how we can describe personality. If you'll remember in webinar this week, I suggested to you that measuring personality was an important part of the clinical evaluation process. So developing tests that measure healthy and non-healthy personality traits are very important to psychologists. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the trait approach to personality, which is what the testing theory is based on. We're going to talk a little bit about two theories of personality. We're going to talk about Hans Eysenck's biological trait theory, and we're going to talk about the Big Five personality test. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between self-report versus projective personality tests. If you were in webinar this week on Tuesday or Wednesday night, you probably got a good lecture on what self-report versus personality tests versus projective personality tests are. But we're going to go over them in a little more detail today. Hi, Jesse. It's good to see you. Fantastic. Oh, good to see you, Jack. Hello. Keelan. Fantastic. Good to see everybody. All right, so personality testing can probably be traced back, I don't know, to what you might call Gordon Allport and the trait approach. He's sort of the father of the trait approach. And this is a method of studying personality that is interested in describing what personality looks like. People from the trait approach are interested in creating tools. A personality test is a measurement tool that measures individual differences. So personality tests are interested in trying to understand what types of personality traits all of us have. So what are the number of traits that we need to fully describe personality? I suggested to you in webinar that there are 5 personality traits that can describe all of personality. So we might ask the question, how is everyone like you? Personality tests also allow us to compare people on dimensions and come up with similarities and differences. How are some people like you? And then people from the trait perspective are interested in those qualities that make us unique. 1 in 3.7, or excuse me, 1 in 8 billion people here in the world. So personality trait theorists are interested in sort of answering this question. How are we all similar? How do we group into reliable differences in personality? And how are each and every one of us unique? You think a slide is duplicated. Aha, I do have a slide that is duplicated. You know what, I'm going to skip right over that and I will remove that. We'll get to that in just a minute, Riley. I'm sorry, I make mistakes sometimes. It happens. Please don't think poorly of me. But I will try to get it better next time. Do it better next time, okay? All right. So, approaches to test construction. Where do you start? This might be a little bit much for an intro psych class, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there. There's two ways really to create a personality test. The first is to come up with a theory of what you think personality looks like, and then you design a test, all right, to measure the theory that you've developed, okay, and that's what's called a theory-driven test. Or what you might do is you start by asking people questions, and through trial and error, you find out which personality traits give you the most accurate description of people and the best ability to compare differences among people. And that would be the data-driven approach. So do we start with an idea of what personality looks like and make a test? Or do we start making up tests and let them tell us what personality looks like? Do you kind of understand the difference between those two sort of approaches to testing? Go ahead and type yes or no if you get that. I hear you. I hear you. Thank you very much, Riley. I need all the help I can get. You know what I mean? Okay. So let's talk first about. Let's talk a little bit about one theory-driven approach to tests that your book talks about. One of the first personality theories was developed by a fellow named Hans Eysenck, and he called it the biological trait theory. And here's his idea. He started with an idea of how the brain might work and how that might create personality. So his work was based on early research into temperament. And temperament is sort of like the first personality that develops within the first couple of days of life. You may or may not know this, but babies start to show differences in personality styles within days of birth. Now, this is not a mature personality, so we call it temperament rather than personality. But basically, babies start to show differences very early in life. And so Hans Eysenck suggested that this must be some sort of biological mechanism inside us that created this personality. Now, it turns out that if you know anything about the brain and how it works, you notice that we have two kinds of systems. A system that causes us to be aroused, okay, and a system that causes us to be emotional, right? So we've talked about the emotional center in the brain. Can anybody tell me what that part of the brain is that's responsible for emotion? Somebody go ahead and type that in the chat bar and let me know. Amygdala. Fantastic. Absolutely. Good job, good job, good job. Yes, absolutely. So if you know that, you can say, you know what, one dimension that creates personality is how emotional we get. And one of the things that temperament research has shown was that some babies tended to cry a lot and some babies tended to be easier to soothe. Happy babies versus irritable babies. And so that's one sort of biological system that helps maybe create personality or temperament. Now, we didn't really talk about it, but there's also a set of fibers in your brainstem called the reticular activating system, which are responsible for your level of arousal, making you go to sleep at night and helping you wake up in the morning. It connects the pons up there to the thalamus. We did talk about the pons and the thalamus. There's a bunch of nerve fibers that connect those two. And this system is responsible for your level of arousal. Okay? Now, he built his theory and he suggested that you could think of these two biological systems as creating the foundations, the biological foundations of personality. So Hans Eysenck test at first measured people on two dimensions, emotional stability and introversion versus extroversion. Does that make sense? All right. And so he develops a theory, and from the theory, he develops test questions that measure what he thinks are the important parts of personality. Now, the problem with developing a theory-based test is your theory may be incomplete or may not contain enough parts in order to describe how human beings function. And so when people looked at his personality test, they said, this is great, but this doesn't help us understand why some people break the law, why we have antisocial personalities people, why we have psychotic people in the world. And so he was forced to go back and redo his test because his test was based on what was shown to be an incomplete theory of how people function. And so he actually came back and added in a third dimension to his personality test he called psychoticism or constraint, impulse control, if you will. And I can't really tell you that there's necessarily a biological system related to that, but you might think of sort of a testosterone or a dopamine system as being related to people's ability to control their impulse. Right? So this was sort of a theory-based test. We have an idea of how the brain works and what it should do and what kind of personality differences it should create. We then develop a test to measure those personality differences. Now, just as a short note, because we didn't talk about this in chapter 3, but you'll see in the picture down here in the corner, there's a picture of the reticular activating system. And you see how it's that green bar that goes up through the brain stem past the pons into the thalamus. Research suggests that if you can actually measure people's base activity in their reticular activating system. All right, so you can go in and you can measure the electrical activity in different parts of the brain, and higher base activity in the reticular activating system is associated with increased introversion. So think about it. What this says is that people who are more activated and aroused to begin with don't want to be in situations that cause them to be more aroused, right? So an introverted person is somebody whose brain is already operating at maximum arousal. Does that make sense? I'm looking at the screen here and I'm not sure if that makes sense. Right below me you see the optimal arousal theory. And this kind of helps us to explain the link between this biological system and our personality. If your reticular activating system is working on a high level, then you already have a ton of arousal. And so you need less arousal, less stimulation from the world to achieve optimal arousal. On the other hand, if you have a reticular activating system that is not very active, you need more stimulation to activate that system and get you to optimum levels of arousal. Does that make sense? Now, there's a neat video that I'm not going to make you watch because it's an hour long, but there's a video, a YouTube video called The Dangerous Few. And this documentary follows some researchers who believe they can predict people who will grow up to be sociopaths based on levels of brain activity in their arousal centers. And what they suggest to you is that people who grow up to break the law and engage in some of these taboo behaviors are people whose brains don't get as active as ours normally do. So this sort of adds even more support, if you would, to this biological based theory of personality. Yes, if you're interested, it's called The Dangerous Few. Let me type it in the chat bar here so people can remember it. Yeah, it's actually quite spooky, and it opens up the question. See, not all these people develop into these people with antisocial personality disorder. They just have a higher likelihood of. And the question is, some people wonder if by identifying people at this young age, we are sort of creating some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where they turn into the person we thought they were going to be at age 4. Very spooky. Very spooky, right?
Wow.
Okay, now let's stop and talk about what we would call the data-driven approach of the Big Five. All right, so right, I know, Jessica, it would be you definitely couldn't tell the child that because they wouldn't be able to deal with that information. That is a really good point, Jess. So let's contrast that theory-driven test of personality. Do you see how we sort of had this idea of how the brain works, and then we created a personality test to measure the ways in which we think the brain works on a behavioral level? Okay, that's what we would call a theory-driven approach. Now, the Big Five approach, how do you know your optimal level of arousal? You know, that's going to be sort of more a perceptive thing. That's a phenomenological thing, I should say, Keelan. You will know. Just you know what kind of stimulation you like. Some of you like to be totally busy. Some of you like it quieter with less noise. I think each and every one of us knows what our optimal level of arousal is. I think what most people don't know is that it is okay to have an optimal level of arousal and to create their world such that they remain in that optimal level of arousal. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Keelan? I can't really tell you, only you know. But what I would say to you is feel confident in your own beliefs of what your optimal level of arousal is. This was the goofed up chart. I started with this chart and then I started editing it. That's the problem, Riley, see, and then I forgot to delete the wrong chart out. But I'll fix that, okay? So, let's go to the Big Five approach. That's okay. It's good to see you, Princess. Nicole, it's good to see you. I'm glad people are filing in. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the data-driven approach. Now, instead of coming up with a theory and developing a test to measure that theory, let's instead just start creating tests and find out which one most accurately captures the data that we collect. Let me give you an example. So you're going to let the data tell you what personality looks like. You're going to give people a set of traits or a set of situations, and then you're going to let them tell you what personality looks like. What exactly do you mean, Chris? Well, it turns out there's probably, I've heard different estimates, but there are literally thousands of adjectives out there that can be used to describe people's personality. You can be conscientious, you can be arrogant, you can be shy, you can be reserved, you can be unctuous, you can be persnickety. There are tons of different words that describe personality, right? But for each and every one of us, there are a certain set of words that are more descriptive than other words. Does that make sense? So not all personality traits apply to you, Nicole Ortiz. Not all personality traits apply to you, Riley. Instead, you all have a subset of traits. Key wins persnickety. And theory-driven approach correspond with self-report, test, or projective. Either one can be. That's a good question. Tara, that's another distinction we make in how the test tests personality. So this is the theory behind the strategy for developing tests. And self-report versus projective is the method of measuring the personality. Does that make sense? So I could create a data-driven test and give it as a self-report or measure it in a projective setting. Does that make sense? Perfect. Okay. So the data-driven approach, persnickety. Persnickety is uptight, annoyed. A complaining person would be a persnickety person. Okay? And then an unctuous person would be an ass kisser. Right? One of those oily, greasy butt kissers that you just love to hate, right? I know, I've got all the descriptive words. Okay, so here's the deal. Let me go to the whiteboard real quick. Now, let's look at 6 personality traits you could have, okay? So, let's say argumentative, talkative, enthusiastic, stubborn, outgoing, and strong-willed. Those are 6 different descriptive words that we could use to describe people. Now, when we give a sheet with these words on it and ask people to check the words that are them, what you're probably going to find is that people tend to check these words into groups that tend to stick together. So, for example, the people who pick stubborn are more likely also to pick strong-willed and argumentative. On the other hand, you might find a person that picks talkative, and they're probably going to pick enthusiastic and outgoing too. So do you see how when people start picking among these words, they tend to pick them into groups, if you will? Does that make sense? Okay, now this is not exactly how a factor analysis goes, but a factor analysis works on the same principle, and it allows us to sort of figure out how descriptive words that people use to talk about themselves are grouped. So then what we do is now, Etta, we have to interpret what these groups of words have in common. And that gives us the personality trait. Okay? Does that make sense? So, look at argumentative, stubborn, and strong-willed. If you look at the Big 5 personality traits right here, which Big 5 personality trait seems most described by the 3 words argumentative, stubborn, and strong-willed? What would you think? What would you think? Okay, okay. I don't know if I'd go with extroversion. Let's look at it one more time. Argumentative, stubborn, and strong-willed. Or talkative and sounds like extroversion. Oh my goodness. Okay, I would say, fair enough, okay. I would say that that actually represents agreeableness, but that's just me. Argumentative people are not agreeable. Stubborn people are not agreeable. And strong-willed people are not agreeable. So I would say those are agreeable traits. What about talkative, enthusiastic, and outgoing? What personality trait would that describe?
Good job.
Absolutely. Good job. Extroversion or maybe agreeableness. Okay? Yeah, Monka, go ahead and ask. What's your question? All right, jerk off. Get lost. All right, so the factor analysis is a statistical technique, and it looks for clusters of items. And so if you look at all of these descriptive words, what you're going to find is that you have 5 broad clusters of personalities, and all of the descriptive traits that there are in the world can be broken up into 5 broad categories: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Jack was actually dropped from the class earlier this week, so he's back to harass us a little bit. Nice job, Jack. Thanks. Okay, so this is sort of a data-driven approach, if you will, right? So there are 2 different kinds of personality tests. There are what we call 2 different strategies for building tests. There are theory-driven personality tests, and there are data-driven personality tests. So there are tests to measure anxiety. So to see if people have anxiety disorders. There are bipolar disorder tests. And these tests are all developed based upon theories of what these psychological disorders are. Does that make sense? So we can measure codependent behavior because somebody has come up with a theory about what codependent behavior is. So these are theory-driven tests. On the other hand, the Big 5 and some other factor and analytic tests are built based on data that people collect, and that they use these statistical techniques to sort of figure out what the underlying categories are. Okay? So I can be between the 2? Yes. I can be between the 2. I'm not exactly sure what you meant, Etta. Ask that question again if you want, and I'll answer it. Okay, so another thing that psychologists are interested in when it comes to personality is whether or not personality is created by our genetic endowment or by our environment. So just like when the first IQ test, people began to ask the question whether or not these qualities are IQ is a function of your genetics or your environment. When personality tests were developed, people became interested in trying to understand whether or not personality tests are a product of our genetics or our environment. And I will refer back to the behavioral genetic studies that we talked about. There are twin studies where we look for, we try to assess how important genetics are in creating the trait. And so we look at people who have different levels of genetic similarity, and we look at how much agreement they have on their personality traits or how much concordance there is on these traits. And then there are adoption studies where we look at people who are put in a family situation with people who are not genetically similar at all. And so you can use both of these 2 types of research designs to figure out whether or not genes or the environment play a stronger role in people's personality development. Now, if you look right underneath me, I've got the results from these twin studies and these adoption studies. And what this research suggests is that personality, by and large, is genetically determined. Now, your kid's environment may or may not exacerbate their shyness or their introversion, but really, it probably looks like people's levels of anxiety, of their extroversion, of their agreeableness, seems to be determined more by genes than by environment. So, if you look down below, identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins on Big 5 traits. And you know what? The weird thing is, if you see identical twins who are raised apart, they seem to have more similar personalities than identical twins raised together. Can anybody tell me why? why twins would have more similar personality if they're not raised together than if they're raised apart. I'd be curious if anybody can answer that question. And it looks like people at twins, as they get older, are more similar than younger twins. Oh, there you go. Well done, Michael Kirko. Well done. That is fabulous. You hit it. I would argue that if you're living in the same household, you're probably trying to differentiate yourself. And that's why when you look at twins at 12 and then measure them at 32, you're going to find that they're more similar in personality at 32 than they are in 12 because they moved out of the house. They are not together. Oh, you did? Okay, well, I'm glad you did, Leanne. So I'll give you a thumbs up too. How about this?
Good job.
A good job for you too. Okay, so adoption studies tend to show that non-genetically related siblings show no correlation on personality traits. And adopted children show no correlation with parents on personality traits. So the research looking at the relationship between environmental similarity and personality similarity shows no effect of the environment on personality. Nicole is a fraternal twin, and you are nothing like him. Was he older or younger, Nicole? I'd be curious. Twins are separated out, and then they were found out they were twins. I'm not sure. Twins. I don't know if she's talking about that comedy, Nicole, the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. I don't know if any of you ever saw that one. Oh, Kirko remembers it. That's freaking hilarious. It's a great comedy if anybody's interested. All right, now, another question that we ask about personality tests, and they ask it with the big five, is how does our personality change as we get older? Okay? And so you can think of if you ask the question, does people's personality change? I would say yes and no. How about that? Do people's personality change? Yes and no. Okay? Now what does that mean, Chris? What that means is in an absolute sense, as you get older, your personality will change. You will become less extroverted, more agreeable, more conscientious as you get older. The only thing is, all of your cohorts are changing the same way. So we're all getting more agreeable. We're all getting less extroverted. We're all getting more conscientious. So if you look at personality in an absolute sense, it does change as you get older. However, relative to your cohort, your peer group, personality doesn't change. Does that make sense? Exactly, Etta. That's why you can always count on an older person to do what they say because they're more extroverted. Older people are just, when you get a little bit older and less strong and robust, you're going to become a little more introverted and a little more reserved. However, you don't change compared to your peer group. Yeah, I do think that is kind of neat. Okay, let's see. Now, I forget who asked the question about, Tara asked the question about projective versus self-report tests. Now, the big five personality test that you took this week, the self-esteem test that you took earlier this week, were what we call self-report tests. And that's when we ask the person to tell us directly how they feel, how they think, and how they believe they would act in certain situations. That's what we call a self-report personality test. The only problem with self-report tests, well, the advantage of self-report tests is we usually ask people to rate themselves on numerical scales. And these numerical scales allow us to compare and make differentiations between people. So we can compare people, we can come up with standards, we can come up with norms, and we can sort of start making lots of statistical comparisons among people and groups of people. And that's how I can tell you right now that personality changes, but it doesn't change. Because we measure people's personality in self-report tests using these numerical scales, we can make very specific numerical comparisons. And that's a great advantage of the self-report test. The only problem with self-report tests is sometimes people don't give accurate answers. Either they don't really know how they would behave in a certain situation, or they're afraid to tell people how they would behave in a certain situation. And I'll bet some of you, when you took the personality test, you even had trouble answering some of the questions because you might have said, it depends on the situation. What exactly do you mean? That is to say, the structure of the question was too rigid and prevented you from telling me exactly how you would behave. Does that make sense? So personality tests, they're great for making comparisons among people, but we have to admit that sometimes people don't tell us the truth. And yes, Etta, sometimes it depends upon their mood. And we talked a little bit about the difference between measuring traits versus measuring state. If I'm measuring your mood, I'm measuring a state. If I'm measuring your personality, I'm measuring a trait. Now, I would argue to you that as a general rule, most personality traits are tests give pretty consistent scores. I would say they measure trait more than they do state. However, Etta, yes, depending upon whether or not you've had a good or a bad day, your test scores may change just a little bit. That's a really good point. I feel like anxiety changes my personality. It does. It probably does in a temporary way, Nicole, but I would bet your personality kind of bounces back to normal when you achieve your normal, typical personality state, be that anxious or calm. Right? How's the personality change with different friend groups? Like, what is the reason of acting different with different people? Oh my goodness. Right. You know what? That's the thing. People can manage their behavior. And what you're talking about, Jude, is impression management, or what we call self-monitoring. And self-monitoring is actually a personality trait in and of itself. High self-monitors look at the social situation and change their behavior up to accordingly. And other people who are low self-monitors don't really care what people are doing in their situation and stay more consistent to themselves day in and day out. Does that make sense? So being a self-monitoring is actually a personality trait in and of itself. Like code switching. Absolutely, Keelan. Right? Wow, you folks are asking some really good questions today. Some really, really good questions. Now, I want to contrast the self-report testing strategy with what we call the projective testing strategy. And in the projective testing strategy, what we do is I give you an ambiguous situation, I watch you interact with that situation, and then I try to guess your personality based on your behavior. I have a projective personality test that I do every semester, the first day of class, to determine who is extroverted and who is introverted in my class. As students come into my class, I say hello to every student that walks into my class the first day. Hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? And you know what? I notice that some people smile and say hello back to me and give me this warm smile as they walk in, and they go and sit down. Some people will say hello to me, but they won't make eye contact. And then some of you won't even say hello to me or make eye contact. And I can tell your personality based upon how you act in that given situation. I know you would, right? Tara, I can tell when you're on, when you come to webinar, you always turn your video on and smile at me. Actually, whether or not you use your video in webinar gives me a clue as to how introverted you are. How many of you don't share your video because you're shy in webinar? Exactly, exactly. So I would say you might be a little more introverted than Tara Solomon, who puts her video on and shows everybody her basketball jersey. You know what I mean? Tara's all about. So I can guess your personality based upon how you act. Does that make sense? That's sort of the projective testing strategy. Instead, I'll just give you an ambiguous situation and let you tell me what your personality is. Right? Turn it on next week. There's nothing wrong with you, Leanne. Okay, there you go. Chris brings up a good point. He doesn't have a webcam. The problem with a projective test is sometimes you don't know what else is going on. So if I judged your personality based upon whether or not you turned your camera on, uh, would I judge incorrectly about your personality, Chris? Yes, you would. Yes, you would. And so, uh, and so, everybody's talking about showing their face. Okay, Chris, thank you. Probably. At least somebody's listening to the lecture. You folks are crazy. So that's sort of the idea of the projective test. Now, your book talks about two kinds of projective tests. The one is called the ink blot test, where you get an ambiguous set of ink blots, and you have to tell me what these ink blots look like. And the other big common test of personality is what we call the thematic apperception test, the TAT, which is where I give you an ambiguous picture of people and you have to tell me a story about what's going on in that picture. All right. Now, the advantages of projective personality tests is you don't know what the right answer is. Heck, you might not even know you're being tested. My students, when they walk in the classroom on the first day, do not know that I am making a test of their personality. They don't know that, right? And so it's harder for them to fool the test because they're acting the way they normally would. All right. On the other hand, and they can also behave naturally normally, and I can take into account everything they do to make a judgment about their personality. So if you come in with dark sunglasses on and your hat pulled down low in a hoodie, that gives me another clue as to whether or not you're an extrovert or an introvert. If you walk into my classroom wearing purple and green and yellow and pink and your hair is 4 different colors, that also gives me a clue as to your level of extroversion. So with a projective test, you just behave and I can use all of my sensory faculties to sort of make a guess about your personality. Or if you walk into my classroom with wine, or you show up at if you show up at the webinar drinking wine, I make a guess about your personality, Nicole. Absolutely. So, the only problem with the projective test is they usually have low reliability. That is to say, if you get two people who are trying to figure out whether or not you are extroverted based on your behavior, they are not going to agree a lot of the time on whether or not you're an extroverted or introverted person. If you look right down here below, right, and I ask you to look at this Rorschach image and tell me what you see, and you tell me you see a butterfly, if me and Dr. Ortiz try to guess whether or not you are extroverted from your answer, we are most likely going to come to different answers as to whether or not you're extroverted or introverted. So there's not a lot of reliability uh, in these tests. On the other hand, if you take the Big Five personality test, once a month for the next 6 months, chances are your personality is going to stay exactly the same. That test is going to measure your personality very reliably, if you will. Okay? Does that make sense? You'd see two fox-looking things? Ooh, okay. I can see that. Most students see a mask. I see, when I give this to my students, my nursing students always see a pelvis. How about that? Does anybody see a pelvis? Could anybody see a pelvis? Nicole, you better see a pelvis. Okay. You're a moth with broken wings. There you go. Just like an artist, Tara. Okay. Yes, but I also see a butterfly. Yes. Well, usually what I find is when I show this image to my nursing students, most of them see a pelvis. And so I can sort of figure out what program they're in based upon their responses. Okay, that's all I had to say. I wanted you to know about theory-driven versus data-driven tests. I wanted you to know about self-report versus projective personality tests. I want you to understand that that Isaac's personality theory was based upon biological structures that are in the brain, the emotional processing of the limbic system, and the arousal system of the reticular activating system. And then I'd also be interested in you knowing the big 5 factors of personality. Remember, personality is an ocean. Personality is an ocean. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. You see that personality is an ocean. Ooh. There you go. Personality is an ocean. So hopefully you should know that. All right, does anybody have any questions about today's lecture? All that ain't not erased bothers me. Ha ha ha. Leanne might be a little compulsive. Where are the C sounds? I don't have any C sounds for you. You know what? I was going to get a couple of barnyard animals for the class, but I thought you folks might think that was too excessive. But maybe I'll have some chickens for you next class. Okay, then. So, you knew it was coming, Etta. All right, so if you don't have any questions for me, I'm going to go ahead and end this broadcast. I'm going to stay online and answer questions in the chat bar for a couple of minutes. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to send me a remind text. Don't forget, discussion board number 13 is due tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. And Neuromatrix number 13 will be up and running tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you folks don't have any questions for me, I'm going to say goodbye and log off. But I will see you next week at 11 a.m. on Tuesday. Take care.